Hi, hello to all my watchers and followers and readers. This is episode number 2 in my series on US-Israel relations, and a little correction to what I said in the beginning of the first episode. There will be 4 episodes, not 3. And as you recall, we ended up the first episode with reference to a turning point, an historic turning point in the relations between the two countries and in the history of Israel altogether in the Middle East, which is the War of 1967, also known as the June War or the 6 Days War. We'll come to that momentarily, but allow me first to kind of repeat, for the sake of those who might have missed parts of the first episode, the main points we made in the first episode about the beginning of American-Israeli relations, and this related to what happened in the Second World War with President FDR, and then the momentous decisions taken by President Harry Truman of recognizing the State of Israel immediately upon its establishment, and beforehand the support for the UN resolution about the partition of Palestine, if you will, the first resolution about the two-state solution that was rejected, by the way, by the Arabs, and that's in reference to what people say today about two-state solution. And then, of course, we talked about the early years of the relationships with the bumps, ups and downs, and a very big down was the way Eisenhower treated Israel in 1956 in the Suez War. In the 1950s, the main supporter of Israel in terms of supplying arms and also diplomatic support was France, which is interesting, mostly when it was under the French Socialist Party at that time, as opposed to the French Socialists of today. The French Socialists of the 1950s, Guy Mollet, for example, and others, were very pro-Israel for all kinds of reasons, and also supplied Israel lavishly with arms. All this started to change with the rise of General de Gaulle to power in what is called the Fifth Republic as of May of 1958, and came to an abrupt end in the War of 67 that we shall refer to soon. But in the case of the US, the beginning of some military relations started with President JFK, who supplied Israel air defense systems, the Hawk missiles, with all kinds of strings attached, but still it was not until 1967 that things changed in a very dramatic way between the two countries. Now, the War of 1967 is a huge topic that I'm not going to get into in this particular series, but I have to mention a few points about it which will give the background to what will happen later on between the US and Israel. This was a war that had to do with the Cold War. It had to do with the Cold War, which raged all over the world at that time. And in the early 1960s, the West won in some areas, the West lost in other areas, the Soviets won in some areas, if you will. Algeria became independent. You can argue a defeat to the Western world, even though General de Gaulle was the one who granted it to the Algerians. Of course, the Cuban Revolution and the failure of the Americans to bring down the Castro regime, as we all know. The beginnings of the war in Vietnam, the Vietnam War, this time with American involvement as opposed to the 1950s when it was French involvement. The Soviets also lost. They lost, for example, in Indonesia in 1965, a huge country with all that happened there. So we talk about ups and downs, and of course there are other examples, both sides. In the Middle East, we have to do with changes that took place in Syria and Egypt and the way the Soviet Union treated them. As of February of 1966, to be specific, 23rd of February 1966, Syria is ruled by what's called the Neoba'ath, which is basically the more radical militant Ba'ath party of mainly the minorities, and especially the Alawis, with names like Hafez Assad already as defense minister and commander of the Air Force and others. And Egypt is, of course, ruled by Abdel al-Nasser, who lost points because of his failed intervention in the Yemeni civil war as of 1962. It wasn't a failure because the supporters of Nasser lost in this war. It was a failure because Nasser lost in the Arab world because of the use of chemical weapons by the Egyptian army against other Arabs, as opposed to the total the peaceful border between Egypt and Israel. So many people in the Arab world said, I mean, look, you kill Arabs, but the Israelis are like enjoying total peace along your border. So Nasser was under pressure. The Syrians were very radical, militant, under domestic pressure, and trying to cause troubles along the border with Israel over the issue of the Jordan River waters and border incidents. As of late 1966, and that's the point here, the Soviet Union put pressure on both Egypt and Syria to get closer. They signed the defense pact, and apparently, and that's something that as of now, so many years later, hasn't been totally clarified. Even when you look at the Soviet archives that were opened after the collapse of the Soviet Union, there were those in the Kremlin who put pressure on Egypt and Syria to cause troubles with Israel as part of the overall configuration of the Cold War. And here it is, the peaceful border between Israel and Egypt, no problems. The problematic border with Syria. And all of a sudden, as of May, to be specific, the 15th of May, 1967, the Egyptian army, in violation of the arrangements after the war of 1956, starting to cross from Egypt through the Suez Canal to the Sinai Desert and amassing on the borders of Israel. The Israelis were surprised. By the way, interesting point. Israeli intelligence failed on this instance to read in advance what would happen, which, by the way, was not the first such failure. In 1960, there was another such failure when Egyptian troops all of a sudden started to amass around the border with Israel without Israelis having any sense of it in advance. That was a crisis that dissipated without any problems. It has to be mentioned, by the way, only in the context of understanding how intelligence works. And in particular, when we talk about Israel, it's referring also to what would happen a few years later in the Yom Kippur War. We'll come to that. 1973. It's an important point here. So the Egyptian army starting to amass along the border with Israel. Nasser starting to make threatening speeches, calling specifically for a war against Israel. Hysteria all over the Arab world. He specifically said he will forbid the movement of Israeli ships from the Straits of Tiran via the Suez Canal, again in violation of every international law, which in itself, by the way, is what they call casus belli, a cause for war. The Israelis are completely surprised and confused. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol, at that time, nice man, very nice man even, the successor of Ben Gurion, lacking any charisma, inviting the Soviet ambassador in Israel at that time, his name was Chubachin, and says to him, I will talk you with me right now, without any prior notice to the Israeli troops in the border with Syria, for you to see that there are no Israeli concentrations along the border with Syria. There's no need for all that. And Chubachin said to him, I don't care about the facts. We tell you not to provoke troubles with Syria, period. So you see here the connection to the overall bigger picture. The Israelis decided to sound out their Western allies, the partners of the War of 56, France and Britain, and then the US. Foreign Minister Rabbi Ibn, not lacking knowledge of foreign languages. He spoke great English, great French. He understood what was said to him. The French and British basically didn't care. Okay, do something diplomatic about it. And then he went to the US LBJ president. What exactly he heard from LBJ in this meeting is not so clear. Did he get the specific green light from the Americans to go to war, a preemptive strike against the troops around the borders of Israel? We'll come to that in a second. Or was it the sense of, well, do whatever you have to do, we are out of it, but do whatever you have to do, any of this? At any rate, when he came back to Israel, the sense in Israel was that the US this time will not act like Eisenhower acted in 1956. call it a mild green light to go to the preemptive strike. In the meantime, King Hussein of Jordan, as we know, joined the Arab coalition under Nasser, put his army under the command of the Egyptians. Syrian army along the borders in the north, Jordanian in the east, Egypt in the south, violation of international law, the blockade on the Suez Canal shipping for Israel. The stupid UN General Secretary at that time, the Burmese, who removed the peace units of the UN from the border because Nasser demanded it from him, again in total violation of the arrangements of 1956. Israel had no choice but to go to the war of self-defense under a national government, a national unity government, with also what was at that time the Herut Liberal Party together, that would become later on Likud, under Menachem Begin. And we know what happened in this war. Total victory for Israel. And no American pressure, as opposed to 56, to stop the war. Israel was allowed at the time to finish the job completely. Israeli troops on the border, on the other side of the Suez Canal, overlooking the Egyptian army on the Egyptian side of the Suez Canal, taking over the West Bank in result of defending against Jordanian aggression, including the holy city of Jerusalem, liberating the holy city of Jerusalem for the Jewish people, and taking over the Golan Heights in the north from the Syrians. In the context of world politics, this was taken to be a victory for an American ally against the Soviets. And what it did also was, it was the first time, probably, that not just getting from Israel, if you are the US, some precious intelligence stuff, like, say, the Israeli intelligence is the one that told the Americans about the famous Khrushchev speech in the Communist Party conference in 1956 about Stalin, or other such changes. Israel proved itself to be a credible, potential, possible ally, being a strong military power. This is the beginning of the relationships with the US to become later on the special alliance between the two countries. At the time when France imposed embargo on Israel, the British washed their hands off. America became now the number one ally of Israel. And that's the historic turning point. Let me make a point to start with. This alliance was very, very helpful to Israel. We'll come to some examples. It was also very helpful to the US. I'll give also these examples. It was an alliance in many respects. It was clear who is the big brother, the US, who is the smaller brother, Israel. It was clear. However, what I want to emphasize here is another important point, because it will also have implications to what would happen much later on, all the way to the days that we are talking about now. Israel developed a dependence on the US, which was much more than just the money getting, which was important, the arms getting, which was important, extremely important, everything was. The UN diplomatic support, the diplomatic support in the UN, very important, and other international organizations. The dependence became part of the collective DNA of policymakers in Israel about what Israel could or couldn't do, should or shouldn't do. It almost became like a psychological burden. And it became an impediment on many occasions to the Israeli freedom of action on issues which were extremely important to Israel. Dependence on a superpower is a problem. It's a problem. And I know lots of people say that the Israeli lobby in the US, and we'll come to all that, so influential. America depended on Israel. America was really the one that listened to Israel. In reality, almost every time, not always, but almost on every time, after 67, when an Israeli government, whether it was still the Labour governments until 77 or Likud governments mostly after 77, when they had to make a big decision, they referred it first to the US. What do you think? I leave it as an open issue here. I just mentioned it. Some will say it was a great idea. The great Ben Gurion went to the War of 56 only after he had this alliance with France and Britain. However, in 48, he established the state without consulting first with the US or getting their approval. In 1967, as I said before, you can argue whether Israel got the green light or not, but Israel went to war with its own independent sovereign decision. Here is an example what this psychological dependence created. Take the War of 73, the Yom Kippur War. Still an open issue. How could it happen that Israel was so surprised? You know, you already heard before an example of how Israel was surprised on other occasions. So let's leave this one aside. A lot of it had to do, and I have to say it, with the fact that also the US said to Israel, the Arab armies are a mess, but it's not going to be a war. And the Israeli decision that it's not going to be a war, even when in the last 24 hours ahead of the beginning of the war, it was already clear there's going to be a war, and the Israelis knew that, they still decided not to preempt because they wanted to make sure that there would be an American diplomatic support once the war starts. And that's a controversial decision, big decision, crucial historic decision. And that refers to what I said about the dependence on the US. Fact of the matter is, the US, under the policy mostly dictated at that time by Kissinger, we know was already happening domestically in the US, Watergate scandal and all that, which weakens President Nixon as a president, but Kissinger was the architect and spokesperson and executor of American foreign policy. He was part of those who put pressure on Israel not to finalize the war by totally defeating the Egyptian army when the third Egyptian army was already besieged by the Israelis. Maybe a great positive decision because it could have helped later on President Sadat to come to the idea of making peace with Israel, because he could argue that the war of 73 was a partial or full victory for Egypt and not a total defeat, as it could have been if the Israelis were allowed to continue the siege over the third army of the Egyptian army, the third army as they called it, and totally destroy it, as was so easy for them to do at the time when the war was stopped. But there are other examples on either side of the spectrum here, how the Israelis made big decisions without consulting with the US, how they did it only because of consulting with the US, but altogether it became almost like a dictum in Israeli foreign policy and security policy. Can we or can we not do it because of what America will say or do? And that's how I leave it here. That's a factor. To say it was wrong or it was right is wrong because it depends on so many other examples. And it depends on the specific situation that we talk about. So this alliance as of 67 had so many components. The financial support to Israel, fantastically significant, even though as of 2006, and many people don't know it, the civilian aid stopped. It's only military aid. And of the money that Israel gets as military aid, 75% of it goes back to shopping in the US, which means that the net aid to Israel is only 25% of the $3 or $4 billion a year. But still, it's important. And I'm not saying what I'm saying now in order to belittle it. I'm just to put it in context. absolute support, almost, in international organizations, including the veto power on anti-Israel decisions in the UN Security Council. Very significant. Support to Israel in times of domestic issues in Israel, for example, the big financial economic crisis of the early 1980s, with the inflation, hyperinflation in Israel at that time, hyperinflation, I should say, in that time, as a result of the economic policies of the Begin government at that time, and his late final minister, Yoram Aridor, the so-called dollarization plan and all that, a lot of American support. It was clear that America considered Israel to be a great ally, even though it still had Arab allies. Saudi Arabia continues to be. As of the Peace David Accords of 1979, Egypt is becoming part of the triangular of the main allies of the US in the Middle East, Egypt on one end, Saudi Arabia and Israel in the middle. A lot of support. And I can go on and on and on. And two elements which were very, very significant in this support were the bipartisan support, which most Israeli governments cared very carefully to maintain the support of both parties. Very significant. We'll see more of it in the next episode. And the rise of the American Jewish community as a major block of support to Israel, which was not as strong in the 1940s or even the 1950s, but became much stronger in the 1960s, late 1960s and early 1970s, with regard to the struggle for Soviet Jewry and supporting Congress and on the level of the different states in the US. Israel was helpful to the US on various occasions. Take, for example, the crisis in Jordan, 1970, Black September, when the Syrian army invaded Jordan and Israel forced them out. Something that was in Israeli interest, but significantly in American interest. Israel, in that case, was doing something that was in the service of the entire Western world. Not for nothing, Joe Biden, of all people, said on one occasion that Israel is like another aircraft carrier for the US. Interesting statement that he made before he was president. We have to remember that. Israel helped the US with regard to situation in Iran before the revolution by providing intelligence that was precious but was ignored by the US. Israel helped the US before the Saddam invasion to Kuwait in 1990. I can tell you something that very few people are aware of. A high-level Israeli delegation in the middle of July flew specially urgently to the US to caution them about what can happen. And the US said, we don't know. They should have known. So they sent the unfortunate Ambassador April Gillespie in Baghdad to talk with Saddam Hussein, 28th of July, and we know what happened there. Saddam Hussein promised her nothing would happen. 28th of July 1990, 4 days later, 2nd of August, the invasion started. Israel agreed not to retaliate to Saddam sending 42 missiles to Israel during the Gulf War of 91 as part of the alliance with the US, because the US did not want it to be an Arab-Israeli war if Israel was to react, as opposed to a war of the US with an Arab coalition, including even Syria, against Saddam Hussein. And we can go on and on like this. The balance sheet, of course, is, and one should say it, in this alliance, Israel benefited enormously. There's no question about it. What did alliance do to the overall decision-making process in Israel is also something that we should have mentioned, and I did, and we have to bear it in mind. In a way, it made Israeli policymakers somewhat complacent in making some crucial decisions, realizing, and on some occasions mistakenly, that the alliance with the US would do the job for Israel. And there are two approaches here in general terms from an Israeli perspective about how to handle all this. Should we trust only ourselves and always and absolutely so? Is it even possible? Or should we measurably trust a great ally? And what's in between these two approaches? Our next episode will be about the emerging of forces within the alliance, both in the US and in Israel, that I already say now were to weaken it in a gradual but systematic way that was not always recognized, definitely not in Israel as such. And that will lead us to the fourth episode, which would be the current situation with Donald Trump. See you next time.
Join the conversation at Fair Observer and subscribe to our YouTube channel.